The old countess looked at him and forgot how to breathe. She knew that face. She had seen it once before. In Venice, 50 years ago. The man she remembered had been 45 years old. The man standing in front of her now had not aged a single day.
"Forgive me,"
she whispered.
"Was it your father I met all those years ago?"
"No, madame," he said softly. "It was me." She told him that was impossible. The Saint-Germain she had known would be nearly 100 by now. He only smiled and began to describe the evenings they had shared half a century before, the dress she had worn, the garlands in her hair. And then, quietly, he hummed a small melody, a song he had written for her in Venice, 50 years gone. The Countess cried out and fainted. His name was the Count of Saint-Germain, and 30 years after that night, a church register would record his death, a death that almost no one who knew him ever believed, because the people who buried him kept meeting him afterward, for years. Some would swear they saw him a century later, the same face, the same age, in a world that had moved on without him. So the question is not how this man died. The question is whether he ever truly began. He stepped into the 18th century already finished. No childhood anyone could name, no birthplace any archive could confirm. As if he had walked into the world fully formed and already middle-aged. The first hard record of him is London, 1745. England was at war with itself. A Stuart prince was marching south, and the crown's agents were hunting foreign spies through every drawing room in the city. So when a gentleman with an unplaceable accent and a fortune in diamonds appeared from nowhere, speaking French, German, English, Italian, and Spanish, each without a trace of an accent, they did the only sensible thing. They arrested him. And then, days later, they let him go. No charge held. No identity established. Horace Walpole, who chased half the gossip in Europe, could only describe what everyone else would spend the next 40 years describing. A man who played the violin like a master, who sang, who composed, and whom no one alive could place. They had held him in a locked room. They had questioned him in 5 languages, and they had learned nothing. So who releases a suspected spy after learning nothing about him? Someone who realizes the man across the table is not what they're equipped to understand. 13 years later, the trail surfaces somewhere far more dangerous than a London cell. The court of Louis XV, Versailles. He did not arrive as a petitioner begging for favor. He arrived as an intimate of the king himself. And it was here, surrounded by the most ruthless gossips in Europe, that the court witnessed the thing none of them could explain. The king owned a diamond, beautiful, but flawed, a crack locked deep inside the stone. With the flaw, it was worth 6,000 francs. Without it, nearly twice that. The king handed the stone to Saint-Germain. A month later, Saint-Germain handed it back. The flaw was gone. The royal jeweler examined it, weighed it, and valued the diamond at 9,600 francs. He could not explain how it had been done. There was no record of the stone being cut, no second diamond purchased, no invoice, no payment in any ledger at court. Only the gem remained, perfect and impossible. And that detail opened a door no one at Versailles could close. Because if he could make a flaw vanish from inside a diamond, where exactly did all his money come from? He held no land. He claimed no inheritance. He took no fee from any king. Yet his rings, his buckles, his snuff-boxes blazed with diamonds, and he crossed Europe like a man who owned the roads beneath his carriage. A man cannot spend a fortune for 40 years and leave no trace of where it began. He did, and the longer the court watched him, the stranger the small things became. He would sit at a desk and write 2 letters at the same moment, one hand shaping prose, the other shaping verse, and neither hand fell behind the other. He dined at the finest tables in Europe, and never ate. The plate before him stayed untouched. He sipped only water, or a tea he brewed himself, and watched the room while the nobility feasted. His body, he said, had no use for ordinary food. They laughed at that. Then they went home, and they wrote it down. But the thing the Age of Reason truly could not file away was the one the old countess had seen for herself. He did not grow old. It was not one rumour, it was a pattern, the same impossible observation made again and again by people who had no reason to coordinate their lies. Madame de Pompadour, who kept him in her circle, noted that across the years she had known him, the Count did not appear to age a single day. Others said it in letters that did not trust one another. A man frozen at the edge of middle age, watching everyone around him grow grey. When they pressed him, "How old are you, truly?" he gave the same answer every time. "Madame, I am very old." It was against all of this that the loudest skeptic in France finally weighed in. Around 1760, Voltaire sat down to write to Frederick the Great of Prussia. Voltaire, who believed in nothing he could not prove, who tore apart kings and churches with a single sentence. And in the same letter where he mocked Saint-Germain as a fraud, he wrote the line that would outlive them both. A man, he called him, who never dies, and who knows everything. He meant it as a joke. But even Voltaire, sharpest blade of the Enlightenment, could not find the seam in the performance. He could not catch the trick. And a man who cannot be caught begins to look like a man with nothing to catch. Twice, governments tried to detain him. Twice, he vanished before the warrant could be served. Gone in the night, no direction, no trace, as though the city had simply agreed to forget him. And then, in 1779, the impossible man did something almost ordinary. He grew quiet. He accepted the protection of Prince Charles of Hesse Castle and settled into a laboratory the prince provided in a small town on the cold Baltic coast called Eckernförde. The prince watched him work metals for hours, recorded their conversations, and came away certain he had stood in the presence of something extraordinary. And it was there, on the 27th of February, 1784, that the end finally caught the man who had outrun it for 40 years. A clerk opened the parish book to a clean page. He wrote the date. He wrote the death. He closed the entry, no different on its face from 1,000 others in that same book. For the first time, the man no record could trace to a beginning had, at last, an end. It should have been the final page in his file. It was not. 1 year later, 1785, his name appears among the living at a Freemason gathering in Paris. Then travelers placed him in Vienna, alive, unchanged. Then came the Comtesse d'Adhémar, a former lady of the French court. She wrote that she met him again in 1789 as the revolution began to devour the old world, and that he warned her of the blood that was coming. She wrote that she saw him again years later, and again. Her account stretches the sightings as far as 1820, 36 years after the church book said he was gone. And in every meeting, she swore, he looked not a day older than he had at Versailles. None of it was ever confirmed. These are testimonies, names attached to memories, written by people who swore they believed them. But the story refused to stop where the evidence ran out. Each retelling pushed him further. A decade became 3. 3 became a century. By the 1890s, more than 100 years after the funeral, new societies in London and in India claimed he had appeared to them still, a master who could not die, walking quietly through a world that had buried him 100 years before. No record supports that. It is folklore now, not document. And yet it is the folklore that outlived the church book that started it, still whispered long after most people had forgotten there was ever a church book at all. So pull the threads apart, one at a time, and each phrase into something ordinary. A foreigner with money and no past. A courtier who mended a diamond. A joke from Voltaire that hardened into a claim. A burial paid for by a prince. A handful of witnesses who could not keep their dates straight. None of it, alone, proves a man who could not die. And yet the whole refuses to come apart as cleanly as its pieces. Because to dismiss the Count of Saint-Germain, you have to answer the one question none of his doubters ever could. Not how he died, the register settles that. But where? In a century that wrote everything down, he began. Some men leave a death, and no beginning. And the file stays open.